This week marks the 6th anniversary of the BP Gulf oil spill, one of the worst man-made environmental disasters in this nation's history. The disaster itself resulted in millions of gallons of crude oil pouring into the Gulf of Mexico, devastating the livelihoods of individuals and the economies of coastal towns all along the Gulf of Mexico. In many ways, the disaster has continued to unfold even 6 years later. RT correspondent Manuel Rapalo gives us a look back at some of the key events of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill.
When news broke of a possible oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico on August 20th, 2010, images like this one here of BP's Deepwater Horizon oil rig gave people the first glimpse of what this disaster might mean. In fact, the tragedy, which we know now was entirely avoidable, was set in motion by a series of safety shortcuts, which led to an explosion on that rig that claimed the lives of 11 workers, devastating hundreds of miles of U.S. coastline and poisoning the waters of the Gulf of Mexico. You see, less than a week before the disaster, an employee for Halliburton warned BP via email of a severe risk to the rig's stability. The very next day, Brett Cocales, a BP manager, replied with an email adding that, quote, "Who cares? It's done. End of story. We'll probably be fine and we'll get a good cement job." In the days and weeks that followed the rig explosion, the world watched helplessly as millions of gallons of crude oil and natural gas poured from the Macondo prospect well. It would go on just like this for 87 days, until the oil well approximately 5,000 feet below the surface was capped. On June 16, 2010, President Obama met with BP Chairman Carl-Henrik Svanberg, discussing the efforts to shut down the well and the reparations necessary for the oil cleanup and compensation for all those affected. Over the next few years, BP would face a plethora of litigation, including more than 200 lawsuits against the company. In November of 2012, the U.S. government announced a ban against BP from any new federal contracts. Then, on September 4th, 2014, a federal judge found BP in gross negligence ahead of the spill, adding that the company's conduct was reckless. This paved the way for billions of dollars in fines. But it wasn't until July 2nd, 2015 that a settlement was reached. BP agreed to pay $18.7 billion in damages to 5 U.S. states along the Gulf Coast. That's roughly $215 million for each of the 87 days that the spill lasted. BP agreed to pay the fine over the next 18 years. Now, 6 years after the spill, local economies along the Gulf Coast are starting to recover. Wildlife is beginning to rebound, but much of the impact of this devastating spill will linger for generations. Manuel Rapalo, RT Studios, Washington.
Over the course of 87 days, millions of barrels of crude oil poured into the Gulf after a rig exploded. According to new scientific evidence, the size of the damage is even bigger than initially reported. For more details, we cross now to RT's Marina Portnaya in Miami. Marina, oil from the BP spill washed up on the shorelines of Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, and Florida. The pollution was shocking and severe. How much worse is it from what was previously thought?
Well, Anya, a team of scientists surveyed the affected shorelines and found a 19% increase of pollution. This means the oil's reach and its damage extended further than previously reported. Scientists from the federal government's National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and private research companies found oil along 1,313 miles of the shoreline after the spill. That's an increase from the 1,049 miles that was previously reported to the public. Now, according to the new data, Louisiana had the majority of oil-slicked coastline. Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida also suffered damage. Texas suffered the least. Oiling was found both on beaches and coastal wetlands. Scientists used remote sensors and on-the-ground observation, including recent data from cleanup efforts, to put together their report.
And 6 years later, what kind of lasting impact are we still seeing from the spill?
Well, the National Wildlife Federation says the impacts on dolphins, sea turtles, and many other species are still being felt today. Experts say more than 3/4 of pregnant bottlenose dolphins in the oiled areas have failed to give birth to viable calf in the years since the disaster. The oil spill has substantially hurt the region's fishery because more than 8 billion oysters are estimated to have been lost. Birds have lost islands that were once used for migration and nesting grounds. Several states like Alabama and Louisiana are still struggling, but making their way back to recovering the tourism that was lost in the years following the spill. This is something Manny just touched on. And according to reports, though, Anya, about 30% of the spilled oil is still unaccounted for. Some scientists believe it may have sunk to the bottom of the ocean. If so, it can create long-lasting damage, but to what extent, no one yet knows.
And this new scientific evidence comes just a few weeks after a federal judge finalized BP's settlement with the government over the spill. If the pollution, as scientists argue, is larger, will BP held responsible for additional charges?
Well, that would be up to the Obama administration and possibly the governments of each state affected. Federal scientists are presenting a larger scope of damage, and many environmentalists would argue that BP needs to be held accountable for the spreading solution. Now, BP finalized a $20.8 billion settlement in response to the spill. It was the largest pollution penalty in U.S. history. But get this, according to reports, BP could receive $5 billion in tax write-offs by classifying a portion of the penalty as a business expense.
Fascinating. That means, I remember we filed a report on that a few weeks ago. Basically, the argument there is that taxpayers then end up subsidizing part of that bill. RT correspondent Marina Portnaya reporting from Miami. Thank you so much.